Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. I am Michelle Rifkin-Fish, Associate Director of the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our Emerging Scholars Talk with our very own Joshua Shelly. We started the Emerging Scholars series in the fall of 2020 as a way to introduce Carolina graduate students and their research to the greater community. These online talks usually are based on the students' dissertation research, and because our students and faculty work in such a wide range of subfields of Jewish studies, I think this series really exemplifies the breadth of scholarship that is taking place on UNC's campus. If you've missed past Emerging Scholars talks, please feel free to view them on the center's YouTube channel. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to make sure you all know about other upcoming events, including our annual Holocaust Remembrance Day lecture next week that will be in person on January 30th, and next month's Sephardic lecture, as well as another Emerging Scholars talk. And last but certainly not least, our March 2nd, 20th anniversary celebration, featuring a reception and a jazz performance with Israeli musician Daniel Zamir. I do hope you can join us. Event details are on our website. These events are made possible through generous gifts to the center. In fact, everything we do at the center is made possible only because of the support of alumni and friends. If you'd like more information on how you can contribute to the center and help us meet our mission, please visit us at jewishstudies.unc.edu. We are delighted to have Josh Shelly here with us tonight. Joshua is a graduate student in the Carolina Duke German program, writing his dissertation on German Jewish literature and its role in the early Zionist movement. His work has been supported by fellowships from the Leo Beck Fellowship Program, the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies, and the Franz Rosenzweig Minerva Research Center at Hebrew University. Josh will graduate in May, and then he will be working as a scholarly librarian at the University of Potsdam, just outside Berlin, on a project to promote open access scholarly publishing. Tonight's talk is titled No Fairy Tale, German Zionism and the Politics of Literature. And after his talk, we will have a brief question and answer period. Please put your questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen. Please join me in welcoming Joshua Shelly.
Thank you very much for your introduction, Michelle, and thank you to everyone who's taken out time on a Monday afternoon to attend this talk. And I think even more, thank you to the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies and all the people who are a part of it for inviting me to present my research. I think that it is quite fitting that one of the final academic events I will take part in before my dissertation defense in spring is sponsored by the center. The center has been a consistent part of my life during my time at Carolina, from the first year when I attended a workshop and received feedback on a grant proposal, to an opportunity that the then director, Ruth von Bernhut, gave me and another graduate student to invite an academic speaker to give a talk. All in all, the center has contributed to and shaped my studies here, and I'm really grateful for it. As some of you may know, the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies is currently celebrating its 20th anniversary. That was something that was just mentioned. And as I sat down to prepare this talk, I had to think back to the 15th anniversary celebration in 2018, and an 8-minute talk that was given at that event by Jonathan Hess. For those who don't know, Hess was an important force during the center's first decade and an early director who laid the groundwork for much of what it is today. Jonathan died, unfortunately, soon after that talk, but I have a recording of what he said saved on my computer. And I revisit it on occasion, and not only because of my attachment to Jonathan, but also because I find in it an extended mission statement for German Jewish studies, and this mission statement continues to resonate with me. The talk covers what is at stake in studying German Jewish history and culture in the 2 centuries before the Holocaust. And in it, Jonathan emphasizes the importance of studying the triumphs of German Jewish life and not just its tragedies. Indeed, speaking of his students, he says that in studying the world of German Jewry, they discover a world that is not alien, but uncannily similar to the world we inhabit today. He continues, I want students to appreciate the way in which German Jewish life offers a crucible for the modern Jewish experience writ large. As I mentioned, this approach to German Jewish studies resonates with me, and I find myself nodding vigorously along when I hear it. Anything else I can say is mere commentary, to quote Hillel. But what is the history of Jewish life, if not a testament to the human ability to produce a lot of commentary? So, in the following minutes, I propose to provide a commentary to Hess's statement in the form of a story about early Zionism. For a not insignificant part of early Zionism, I argue, was in no small part a direct product of and response to German Jewish life and culture. Now, before I go further, I need to make a caveat. Zionism at the turn of the 20th century was a movement represented by Jews from any number of places, including notably the Russian Empire, and they dreamt up a variety of plans and carried on a vigorous debate about what a Jewish state ought to look like. In following the thread that I follow, I am not seeking to marginalize their stories. And yet, my hope is that in following the life of one prominent figure in the Zionist movement in this talk, Theodor Herzl, I'll be able to show how at least one part of Zionism was indebted to Jews' experience of German language and culture. To tell this story, I need to acknowledge another competing story in the room. It's a story that a lot of people tell, including not a few Israeli politicians, who view themselves as the modern day heirs to the early Zionist movement. And the story goes like this. There once was a man, an Austro-Hungarian Jew named Theodor Herzl, who lived in Vienna and Paris. Herzl wanted to be part of mainstream European and German culture, but realized that anti-Semitism was a pernicious force in modern life that would never disappear. In response to this, Herzl argued that Jews needed to create their own state. Based on this belief, he founded the Zionist movement. This movement, the story continues, was a radical break with German Jewry, indeed all forms of assimilated European Jewry. It was a rejection of all that came before it. The Holocaust, moreover, showed just how right Herzl and his followers were. Indeed, this story, which has things to recommend it to it, but overall I would argue has some problems as well. This story implies that anything German and anything German Jewish was and is antithetical to everything Zionist and Israeli. Now, scholars have done a lot of work in the past years to show the flaws of this story, but I'm continuously surprised by how much it continues to permeate our discourse today. So I want to tell a part of this alternative story to give you a glimpse into how German, and especially German Jewish, early Zionism really was. In order to tell this story, I want to bring us back to 19th century Europe. Because even though it feels self-evident today, up until 1871, there was no such thing as a unified German state. Indeed, if we go back to the early 19th century, what is today Germany was really a collection of states, duchies, and principalities, both large and small. Subgroups of them sometimes considered themselves part of a larger whole, but really Central Europe was quite fragmented. About this time, a series of scholars and thinkers began to tell a story. You'll notice that there are lots of stories in my talk. Many of them were scholars, but scholars, I'm here to tell you, are often in the business of telling authoritative stories with footnotes, so you know they're true. And The story this group of scholars told was about the idea that there was a group or an entity called the German people. They called them a Volk. This Volk, they said, had a really long history going back centuries, and they belonged together. They belonged together in history, and they also belong together now in a single political unit called Germany, which at that point did not exist. Two of these scholars were called the Grimm brothers. Maybe you've heard of them, probably in connection with a collection of Märchen, a word that's often translated as fairy tales. But I might also translate them as tall tales. You may have seen some of them when Disney took the liberty of turning them into some movies. What has often disappeared from our collective consciousness about the Grimms today, however, is the fact that when the Grimm brothers presented their collection of tales to the public in book form, they were seeking to do more than just entertain or else scare their readers. They were really seeking to show readers that there was such a thing as a German people. See, look here, they said. This is the people who has existed for a long time and has produced all these great stories. And you, dear reader, also belong to this people, the German people. Early German nationalism took many different forms, and there were different projects like the Grimm's fairy tale collection. But for many, the culmination of this activity was the creation of a unified German state under the Prussian monarchy in 1871. And this is where our story intersects with the founder of modern Zionism, Theodor Herzl. At the time of the founding, Herzl was a young boy, around 11 years old. He lived in Budapest, but his family would later move to Vienna. And even if Vienna was in the Habsburg and not the German Empire, this family identified with the German language and culture. Indeed, a major question of the day was how those in the Habsburg Empire who identified as German ought to relate to the German Empire. I share all this as background to help us appreciate the air Herzl was breathing as he began to articulate and share his idea for founding a Jewish state. And as much as many of us today think of German nationalism, especially at the turn of the century, as inherently anti-Semitic and inimical to the goals of Jewish nationalism, I would suggest that Herzl at his time saw something different. He saw a model. Indeed, for Herzl, Germany was proof positive that the idea of a state could move from idea to reality within generations. All of this, I want to suggest, is an important backdrop for a meeting Theodor Herzl had with the German Kaiser in Jerusalem in 1898. At the time, Herzl sought to secure support from the German Empire because they had influence with the Ottomans, who then controlled Jerusalem and all of what was then called Palestine. His idea at the time was the creation of a German protectorate in the area as the basis for creating a Jewish state. Indeed, as Herzl put this when justifying the idea to the Kaiser, quote, "The vast majority of Jews belong to German culture already." Herzl writes about this meeting with the German Kaiser in his Zionist diaries. Recalling we'll put this up. Recalling the meeting, he writes, "It is like a photograph taken with an unsteady hand. The picture is bound to be a bit blurred. Afterwards, I tried to capture this impression in the form of a metaphor and could only hit on the following. I felt as though I had entered the fairy tale forest where the fabulous unicorn is said to dwell. Suddenly there before me stood a magnificent woodland creature with a single horn on its head. But its form surprised me less than the fact that it existed. I had previously imagined the form, but not the breadth and the life of this creature. And my astonishment grew when the unicorn began to speak in a very friendly human voice and said, 'I am the fabled unicorn.'" The unicorn, just to be clear, is the Kaiser in this setting. Though probably bizarre at first glance, this diary entry captures in miniature key elements that recur throughout Herzl's work and help us, I argue, to think about the relationship between German and Jewish nationalism in Herzl's eyes. Consider what Herzl sees: the leader of a unified Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He's on the left-hand side of your screen. And he appears as a fairy tale figure, a unicorn. It's funny, but truly not so ridiculous if one considers how the Kaiser at that time was often depicted wearing a Pickelhaube, a military helmet adorned with a spike not so dissimilar from a single horn atop the fantastical creature Herzl holds in his mind's eyes. Even more surprising, however, is that the unicorn itself does not surprise Herzl. As he writes, he'd already conceived of it in his mind. What astonished him instead is the breath in the creature's lungs. It lives. The product of the writer's imagination has stepped into human history. To be clear here, I argue that Herzl's use of fairy tale motifs, once again in German the word is Märchen, connects directly to the project of the Brothers Grimm that I explained a few minutes earlier. Indeed, to use the word Märchen in German at the time, and even today, was and is to call up images of the Grimms, the two brothers who undertook their project, again I emphasize, at least in part to support the idea that the German people were real, a historical entity who had created their own culture and ought to have a German state. But note the subtle shift. The fairy tale Herzl witnesses here is not Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty. It is not found directly in the Grimm's collection. It is instead the tale of a unified German people who now have their own unified German state. It is a dream, moreover, that Herzl has seen move from idea to reality in his lifetime. A dream made real and embodied in the man he meets with, the German Kaiser. To risk putting too fine a point on it, I would argue that Herzl sees in this Kaiser-unicorn hybrid a model for a Jewish state, a model that starts off sounding like a fairy tale, but ends up becoming reality. There's proof of this connection, moreover, in a work that Herzl began soon after meeting with the Kaiser. It's a utopian novel entitled Altneuland. In English, we would call this Old New Land. In it, Herzl tells the story about a young Viennese Jew, Friedrich Löwenberg, and his visit to a Jewish society in Palestine 20 years in the future. But Herzl didn't want his story to just stay sandwiched between the pages of a book. He wanted it to become reality, just as the unicorn he had met in Jerusalem was destined to be more than a flight of fancy. Tipping his readers off, he added the following quote emblazoned on the title page: "Wenn ihr wollt, ist es kein Märchen." In English, this is often translated, "If you will it, it is no dream." But the well-known Hebrew version, a quote that became a watchword for the Zionist movement, is a better translation. Im Tirzu enso agada. Agada, Märchen. The word that we translate in English as dream oftentimes is really the German original, Märchen, which is to say fairy tale or tall tale. Thus, Herzl is saying, you see this novel you hold in your hands? If you want it, it is no tall tale. As if to send the point home, Herzl then concludes his novel with an epilogue that reads, "But if you do not want it, all this that I've told you will remain a Märchen." To be clear then, the very vocabulary Herzl employs and the model he draws on is clearly indebted to the paradigm of German nationalism. We see this not only in his clear admiration for the German state, on display when he meets the German Kaiser, but also in his deliberate use of language to tell his readers how they ought to relate to his novel. In other words, to read Zionism as a complete rejection of German Jewry and antithetical to the experience of Jews in diaspora is to miss a vital aspect of the way Herzl understood his part of the Zionist project. If this point has often fallen by the wayside, however, there's a second point that has often become even more obscured in the story people tell about Zionism. It has to do with the idea of the Märchen, the tall tale. because the very word Herzl uses to frame his novel, and indeed the entire Zionist project, is a literary one. This is a second point I invite us to sit with. The way in which Herzl envisioned Zionism was not just a question of diplomatic relations or mass relocation. He considered it also in fantastical literary terms. Indeed, scattered throughout his diary are clear signals that Herzl conceives of Zionism as a product of the imagination that has been set down in the pages of literature. Indeed, in the opening pages of his Zionist diaries, Herzl records just this, quote, "It is still too early to surmise what will come of it. But my experience tells me that even as a dream, it is something remarkable, and that I ought to write it down. If not as a monument for mankind, then at least for my own later delight and reflection, and perhaps something between these two possibilities, that is, as literature. Should the novel not be translated into deeds, at least a novel might stem from deeds. Title, The Promised Land." Consider here how Herzl understands literature not as an outcome that might mark the failure of his idea, but as something that might be translated into deeds or else might stem from deeds. Literature for Herzl is not associated with an action. No, the wall separating deed and fantastical tale is a thin, porous membrane that can easily be traversed. A second quote from Herzl's diaries also warrants our attention. For those who don't know, Herzl's great dream before Zionism was to write for the stage. Yet, while he succeeded in having some of his plays staged, and two of his light comedies became part of the repertoire of the Viennese Burgtheater, Herzl never achieved the recognition as a playwright that he longed for. It was in this context, however, that he wrote of the Zionist project, quote, "Come to think of it, in all this, I am still a dramatist. I pick poor people in rags off the streets, array them in gorgeous costumes, and have them perform a wonderful play of my composition for the world." What I would suggest then, and this is really the starting point of what I seek to unpack in my dissertation, is as follows. The tall tale, the novel, and the theatrical production were all words used by Herzl to point to his understanding of politics. And that is this, that for Herzl, the political was never to be divorced from the literary. Because for him, the political was always the attempt to imagine the fantastical, the unicorn as it were, and then bring it to life. And in this, we discover Herzl, the playwright, because at the heart of his chosen vocation was the idea of crafting a dream and then putting it on the stage. In this, then, I've sought to offer a twofold reading of Herzl. One that celebrates the contribution of a particular Jew who considered himself part of German literature and culture, and by way of German literature, sought to create a contribution to the life of the Jewish people. These contributions weren't incidentally German or incidentally literary, they were consciously so. Having offered this reading, I'd like to close now with an experience I had last summer in Israel when I made a visit to the Herzl Museum in Jerusalem. It offers us, I argue, a way to think about the way we read history and the importance of the scholarship that the Carolina Center for Jewish Studies supports. For those of you who don't know, 2022 marked the 120th anniversary of the publication of Herzl's only novel, Altneuland. In honor of the milestone, the Herzl Museum offered an exhibition celebrating the work. Set aside in an exhibition space next to the entrance to the main exhibit, I and several visitors entered the room. In it, there were massive letters spelling out the name of the novel, Altneuland, written in Hebrew letters. Here you see the Aleph on the left-hand side of your screen. Each letter contained an explanation, a way to read the novel that Herzl wrote as finding its ultimate fulfillment in the Israeli state in which we then found ourselves standing. This, I would argue, is an excellent metaphor for the way we often read history. We take a story written from left to right, and flip it. We start to read from right to left, from present to past. And in so doing, and here I quote Jonathan again, we mistake chronological sequence for historical necessity. In other words, we view in Zionism the necessary and only possible fulfillment that might have ever resulted from Herzl's novel. Israel or other products of the Zionist movement are not an achievement so much as destiny. Now, there are a variety of ways in which the story necessarily ought to come up for critique. In telling the story of Israel in this way, for instance, there's a maneuver that allows the state to evade critique. It is, in so many words, saying that history could have been no other way, and any attempt to imagine any alternative, perhaps better reality is, in some sense, futile. There's a lot to this critique, but I would like to put my finger on a second one. In choosing Hebrew letters over Latin ones, and in structuring an exhibit about Altneuland in the way the Herzl Museum did, it in some way effaced the German Jewish origins of Zionism. In depicting history, moreover, as a straight line, starting with this novel and culminating in the founding of Israel, as if it was always destined to be thus, we are robbed of our ability to understand the true achievement of Zionism, of early Zionism, that is. And this is what I attempt to restore in my scholarship. A celebration of a Jewish accomplishment, and maybe, just maybe, an ability to recapture a sense of the true magnitude of the boldness, the craziness of the Zionist program at the turn of the last century. I seek to recuperate the sense in which Zionism did not appear to many early readers of Herzl's text as a destiny, but as a tall tale. If scholarship can do this, then maybe we'll be able to recreate the experience of encountering in Israel a living, breathing unicorn in a wood. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh. That was fascinating. And we have quite a number of people. We have 54 participants, which is fantastic. And I'd like to welcome everyone to offer a comment or a question in the chat. And I will open the chat now. And I will be happy to read your question. Let's see. Well, nobody has written any questions yet, so I will start us off with one. Can you tell us a little bit more about the ways in which literature was a venue or an arena in which people imagined political change or social changes that might be sort of more just, or a kind of vision for the future? I know that in my own field of Russia, the Russian writers were often using literature and fiction to imagine alternatives. But in that case, it was often because the government would not want them to write. You know, it was still a moment, or it was a moment of censorship. So could you tell us a little bit more about that in the German context?
Sure. So as you mentioned, there also within the Russian context, this happened, and I'm even more familiar with the English context, the English-speaking world. And one of the best-selling novels in America in the 19th century that we know Herzl was aware of was a book called Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. And it was a book that imagined what Boston would look like in the year 2000. Remember, he's writing in the 1800s. And out of this, there was a political movement that was born called the nationalist movement. I believe, I'd have to go back and check this, but it's not what we normally associate with nationalism, but this was a very influential movement. And then within Herzl's context, there was someone who was part of this same zeitgeist. His name was, we have to be careful here, Theodor Herzl, not Theodor Herzl. He also, interestingly enough, was a Jew originally from Budapest, who wrote a book called Freiland. It wasn't only for Jews, it was for all variety of people. And this was also a movement that imagined the way that the world could be and inspired direct political action. I think what I find so lovely about exploring the German Jewish literary tradition around imagining a Jewish state is the wide range of ideas and the ways in which different thinkers responded to either Herzl's text or just the dream of a Jewish state in general, and used literature to imagine what could be. We have to remember that at this time, most Jews did not live in what was then called Palestine. At this time, and even if they did live in Palestine, this wasn't a place that had any sort of Jewish sovereignty. There was a limited way in which Jews could actually exercise control over their destiny, even if they did live in Palestine. And so literature became the way to dream about it. And then not only dream about it, but share your dream with others, and sometimes respond to the dream that other people had also set down in literature.
Fascinating. In some ways, one could say we have film today that does that to some extent.
I totally think so, yeah.
I have another question. Could you tell us a little bit more about the German nationalist ideas? Because I think on the one hand, we have an image of nationalism as very exclusive and sort of, this is for us and we're maybe better than, or we want to protect our boundaries from others. And what was it about the German nationalism that Herzl found particularly useful and interesting and inspiring?
Yeah, I think the one thing that I try to point to a little bit in my talk is that there was this idea that it was possible that there was no state and then there would become a state. And Germany was this example. But you're right that oftentimes nationalism is understood as something that is exclusionary. And even in Herzl's time, there were visions of a German state that were very exclusionary. I don't want to wipe that away or efface that. That was definitely a reality. However, there were also more capacious understandings of the way in which a German state or other states might have room for multiple groups of people. You even see in Herzl dreams, you can criticize them, and there are reasons for that, but there are dreams and an intention to include people who are not Jewish, for instance. So the idea that nationalism is always and only an exclusionary principle, at this period of time, at the very least, people did not always have that intention.
I have another question if if it's okay, and I don't see anyone else. Can you give us a sense of the plot and the main story of Altneuland?
Yeah, so Altneuland is published in 1902, and it takes as its beginning point 1902, and it's it is both fascinating and a little melodramatic. It maybe has not aged well, but I still nonetheless find it fascinating. And it starts off with a Viennese Jew named Friedrich Löwenberg, and he's sitting in Vienna and he realizes that all paths for true advancement in his career are closed to him. He has a friend who's gone off to South America, who's sought to find his way there and has died of a yellow fever, and he's just tired of life. It's very, very overdramatic. And he basically meets a gentleman who says, he's a wealthy Prussian aristocrat who happens to have spent time in America, named Kingscourt, who says, I'm off to my own private island and I want someone to accompany me. will you go with me? And Löwenberg says, yes, I've got nothing to lose. And before he leaves, the little money that he has, he leaves to a poor Eastern European Jewish family. And the next thing we know, it's 20 years in the future, 1922. Doesn't sound like the future to us, but for readers at the time it was. And the King's Court and Löwenberg are basically traveling back from their deserted island, and on their way they visit Palestine. And what they realize is that Palestine that they knew, I should also add that at the beginning, before they go to the desert island, they experience Palestine in the contemporary moment. What happens is first they encounter the poor Eastern European Jewish family that Löwenberg had donated his money to before he left. And they've become the leaders of this great Jewish civilization it's still in that time called Palestine. They have basically, it's divided into 4 books, but in the 5 books, but in the last 4 books, it's a tour through this new society and how great it is and all the wonderful things.
Thank you so much. That's great. And we do have a question that I'm going to now read from Jackie Crute. To what extent does creating fictional, I think they want to say imaginaries or imagined images of political figures and theories affect political action on a civilian level versus an academic level?
Yeah, so the question is, how much of this is academic talk and how much of this is something that actually motivates people? So I have to tell you that one of the reasons that I was attracted to Altneuland was the fact that most scholars, when they read Altneuland, they say, okay, it's political propaganda, it's not really literary, it's not really worth our time. That's not completely fair. There have been people who've done who've responded to Altneuland and provided readings, but there are a lot of people that are like, it's not really interesting, it's only propaganda. But a lot of people read it. A lot of people were captivated by it. And I'll give you just one example of the way in which I think that people were captivated by it, or an indicator of the way that people were captivated by it. So Altneuland was written in German, very important. If you remember nothing else, it's important. But it was quickly translated into Hebrew. And the Hebrew title of Altneuland was taken from the Bible. It is called Tel Aviv. Tel is a mound that's an archaeological product that basically is something old. Alt, the old new land. And Aviv is spring, something new. And a few years later, outside of Jaffa, a group of Jewish settlers want to found a city. And what do they name it? They name it Tel Aviv. So I think that what we see here is, even if it hasn't necessarily aged well, even if people don't necessarily read it today, at the time, people were captivated by it, or at least a subgroup of people. And I think one of the things that it interests me is that I think Herzl had this understanding that people were not necessarily always influenced by tracts. They weren't always influenced by, this is the political program, we're going to follow steps 1 through 10, and after we've gotten to step 10, we will have achieved our goal. They're captivated by images. They're captivated by stories. It's the currency of a political movement. And so in many ways, I would say that this is precisely not an academic discourse. That it is a discourse that in many ways, you have to be careful with this word, but democratic in a certain way.
Thank you so much. Fascinating. Any other final? Well, first of all, I want to thank you, Joshua, for a fantastic, very rich talk, and to wish you luck in your future endeavors. And I hope you'll stay in touch with us here at Carolina and at the center. And I was very touched by your use of Jonathan Hess's work, and I think reminding us of what an amazing scholar and mentor he was, and how much we still have to learn from him. And I also wanted to remind everyone to please join us for the future events that we will be having. And I'll just name a few of them once more. January 30th will be the Holocaust Remembrance Day lecture. February 7th will be the Sephardic lecture, which is on Mizrahim and Zionism, a history. February 16th, we will be co-sponsoring Alon Tal, who actually is a UNC graduate and a member of the Knesset in Israel. And the name of his talk is A Tar Heel in the Knesset, Making Sense of Israel's Tumultuous Parliament. And I'm sure it's going to be a great talk because he is a wonderful speaker. February 20th, we will have another Emerging Scholars talk by Oscar Senze. This will be remote, and it is called A Galician Wedding, Yiddish Popular Culture and Regionalism in American Jewish Immigrant Life. And then again on March 2nd, we will be having the Heilig event and the 20th anniversary celebration for the center with the Daniel Zamir jazz performance and our celebration. And April 19th, we are co-sponsoring Michael Twitty in conversation with Marcy Cohen Ferris. And I believe that that is about African-American and Jewish food. So it should be just so many amazing events, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much, and Joshua, good luck as you go to your next adventure.
Thank you.